Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, but please call me Alex, and I'm here to talk to everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today I'm joined by guest Mike Duerksen. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me. Appreciate the invite.
So, for those who are meeting you for the first time, could you share a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of a fundraising agency called BuildGood, and we work with medium-sized and small-sized nonprofits to help them really build their revenue from their individual giving. So think of like what we sometimes call the mass level donors to all the way to the mid-level donors. So we help nonprofits with that so they can reclaim their time and get on the phone and leave the office and start building one-on-one, human, messy, unpredictable relationships with donors.
Messy, I like that. So, I want to scratch that surface, obviously, go much deeper into that. But I'm curious to know this is one of my favorite questions to ask people who are in the nonprofit space is how did you start working with nonprofits?
I grew up in South America where both of my parents were social entrepreneurs. My dad was working with small landholder farmers to grow product and then take it to market through an economic development nonprofit. My mom was a nurse. They ended up creating a shelter for children who were either homeless or sort of living on the street. And that grew into a bigger program that also included a school and trades training and a lot more. So I grew up in a family that was always involved in that kind of work. I remember a lot of our holidays being spent at the shelter for kids, just my mom and dad doing the work and us being around. When I grew up, I thought I would go into journalism and media and communications. That's the road that I saw for myself. I took a year between college and went in the middle of college. I took a year off college and I went to Europe. I ended up working for an international development organization in Germany. Liked the sort of internal workings of it. I worked in the warehouse and doing gift and kind stuff. Really liked sort of learning more about nonprofits. Finished my degree and then I started working in communications rather than going into journalism. I started working in communications for a local nonprofit back here in Canada, and been in that field in that sector ever since.
So, you have a much deeper history of nonprofits than some of my guests. I've noticed a trend that people just tend to fall into it for one reason or another and then get stuck in it because they like it so much. But it sounds like you have a background of it. I mean, if your parents were connected to it and you were exposed to it throughout your lifetime, it's great. You have a lot more, I'm sure, than insight in that whole space.
I think one of the things that my parents taught us, not explicitly, just through the way that they lived life, is that, you can serve a market of needs rather than a market of wants. And you can still be an entrepreneur and you can still be entrepreneurial. And doesn't mean that you have to take a vow of poverty necessarily, although my parents lived very frugal lives. But you can have a life, you can raise a family, and you can serve a market of needs. And that can be very fulfilling on its own.
That's great. So, what then made you decide to start the company Build Good?
There's basically two reasons. One of them is in my previous jobs, I had worked on the client side with agencies that were really large agencies that actually allowed for very little input from us as a nonprofit. Very sort of set way of doing things, doing it at mass, doing it at scale for a lot of different clients. And our frustration was always, even though we were, somewhat happy with the results, we wanted greater flexibility. And then when I worked for a smaller shop, I worked with an agency that was very much a small shop and where I lacked some of that process and the rigor that the bigger agency had brought to bear. And I just thought there's got to be a bit of a middle road here for medium-sized nonprofits. And one of the reasons I started Build Good is to bring about the best practices in fundraising and to bring about some of the stuff that the big guys are doing in a much more accessible way for medium-sized shops and smaller shops, where we still bring a lot of rigor to the process, but it's a little bit more of a collaborative environment. And then number two is I wanted more flexibility in my personal life. So as a fundraiser, I was often working evenings, doing events, going to donor meetings. I was working for an international organization. I was also traveling for, 6 weeks out of the year sometimes. And my wife and I started a family and I wanted to be home more. And so, starting my own fundraising consultancy was one of the ways that I could see about still making an impact serving the people I love so much, which are small and medium-sized shops, and having greater flexibility over my schedule and being home more.
Did I understand that correctly? That you taking or try to take the best practices that are provided by large nonprofits and then apply them to medium size? Is that the reason why you don't, at the moment at least, serve the larger sized nonprofits?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that very large nonprofits are very well served already. And so there's a bit of a gap in the market for the medium-sized shops. So we're not solo consultants. We are an agency, so we do bring a bit of a team to bear. And for some of the smaller to medium-sized nonprofits who are sort of, they're raising $1, $2, $3 million a year from individual donors. That's sort of a natural plateau that we've observed that a lot of organizations run into. Once you start getting close to the 2 million a year from individual donors, there's sort of you hit this natural ceiling. And so that's really where we come in. Our ideal client is raising more than $1 million already from individual giving, and probably, less than 10 million.
So with BuildGood, what services do you offer then?
We've got 3 core services that we offer. The first one is just a donor data diagnostic, and that's called a total fundraising review. We look at the performance of your fundraising. So we look at all your data. And then we also interview your fundraising team. We look at your donor communications. We look at all of your fundraising activities. And then the client walks away with a data diagnostic, but also with a strategy on how to improve and how to grow, and areas of opportunities and areas of growth. That's sort of the core service that a lot of our clients start with. The second service is just coaching and consulting, and this is a weekly or bi-weekly support. This is oftentimes best for people who have maybe a novice fundraiser that they've hired in-house, who needs some training and some support and some accountability. And so this is really a you can do it, we can help sort of model. So a lot of the stuff is done in-house on the client side, but we're walking alongside them, guiding them, reviewing a lot of stuff, and then coaching and training them. And then the third service, which is our core service with most of our clients that we currently work with and that we do the best work for, they've opted for this option. And that's the complete done for you model, where we come on board and we run an individual giving direct response strategy through direct mail, newsletters, emails, and then help you with other individual giving activities.
And out of the 3, you said the third is the most popular, right? The expert appeals and analysis?
Yeah, by far, because the value is really if, you could grow your team by hiring another staff member. You could hire a technical player who knows fundraising copywriting, who knows direct response, but chances are you're probably going to hire a generalist technical player, like a communicator, some sort of coordinator, some sort of communications manager, fundraising manager, something like that. You're going to spend a decent amount of money training them. And then that person may leave within 18 to 24 months, which is sort of the average in our sector. And so what you've done is you've in-housed an agency, and then that agency leaves every 18 to 24 months. And so for the cost of hiring an employee or hiring an employee and a half, depending on your budget, you get our entire team working for you, bringing about a fairly rigorous process, bringing about data analysis, bringing the fundraising copywriting and the design and the complete done for you model. So it's probably for value conscious nonprofits out of our services, that's the best sort of service offering that provides the most value.
So then for the total fundraising review, this is a one-time analysis with best practices, strategies. What is the expected outcome that a nonprofit can expect to receive for that one service?
The final outcome is a 2-hour meeting on Zoom that is recorded that they walk away with, plus the actual report. Now, the report is 20 to 30 pages of sort of data analysis, and then we point out different areas of growth. But then in the meeting, in a 2-hour strategy meeting that we have, we walk through the report and we get very, very specific about what your next best step is to grow your fundraising, and we outline that strategy. Now, at the end of that meeting, a client can go and execute it themselves, or they can hire us to do it, or they can hire somebody else to help them with it.
And then for the coaching and consulting, so that's more of a staff augmentation or training perspective. like you said, someone who's a bit more junior, maybe as a fundraiser manager, needs a bit of help, and this would, I guess, would be more for a temporary period of time versus a long-term engagement, or is it a mix of the two?
It's a mix of the two, but most of the time it's it goes month by month, and most of the time it ends up being a 6 to 12 month sort of a thing. Once you've run through a yearly sort of full fundraising cycle with somebody, they're pretty well equipped to just take it from there and run it on their own.
So for these three services, do you have any kind of, I'll use the word qualification process? How are you sure that you can best serve a particular nonprofit? You mentioned there's a kind of a threshold around 1 million as a minimum total revenue for the year, and a maximum somewhere around 10 million. Aside from that, are there any other qualifications that a nonprofit would have or should have to say, yeah, you're a great fit for our services?
Yeah, and I will say that revenue, sort of the minimum and the maximum, that is a general guideline. We have clients who are below that, and then we have clients who are way above that. That is just a bit of a way to see if they're in the sweet spot where we like to work in, but that's not a hard and fast rule. We have, before we ever send a proposal to a client, we usually have 2 to 3 calls with them. So we never send a proposal after the first call. Usually we send a proposal after the third call. So that gives us a lot of time to get to know the client, ask a lot of questions, see if we would be most effective, see if they are best served by us. And if they aren't, then we would point them somewhere else. Or it's not unusual for us to say, hey, I don't think that we're the right fit. But if you want to, we can help you evaluate other agencies or other consultants, so that you end up with the right person to suit your needs. Now, some of the things that we look for, one of the big things that we look for is leadership sort of bought in on this, because we have learned that sometimes a gung-ho fundraiser will bring us on board, but really the CEO or the board or whoever else are not really on board with it. So it's a hard sell. Two, are they just growth minded? Do they have that mindset of wanting to grow, but also knowing why they want to grow? So not just growth for the sake of growing, but do they have a vision for why they want to grow, and are they in a position to invest in growth?
So if I were to call these positive indicators, are there any negative indicators, something that would disqualify, or not disqualify necessarily, but really make you concerned that this is not a good fit? That is not one of the ones you just mentioned.
We've been in, I want to be careful what I say here, but we've been in situations where the person hiring us say, why don't you come and talk to our board and convince them on why we should hire you? That's a red flag. If an organization wants to invest in growth, and if they specifically want to invest in our service, and our service is not for everyone by far, but if somebody wants to invest in our service, they should be able to make that case for support internally. So when they start dragging you in and say, you convince everybody else around me why I should hire you, it's usually a red flag, because it usually means that the person who is trying to hire us doesn't understand the value and or doesn't believe in it. And that just means that the client relationship is probably not going to be the best. So the sale is always the sample. And we always tell prospective clients that, as you're working with us and as we're going through this proposal and whatever, this is the sample of what it's like to work with us. And, it's for us to see how you would be like to work with as a client. It's for you to see how we would be like to work with as an agency. So the sale always acts as the sample. We do have a 90-day risk-free, like guaranteed 100% money back guarantee. So if we start working with anybody, if after 90 days the client doesn't feel like the value is there, they shouldn't have to pay for it. So we'll give them all their money back and we walk away as friends. And I would just much rather do that than get locked into a relationship that may not be valuable for both sides.
Yeah, I find that sense of communication is really important. One of the ways that I qualify people as a potential client is what I call the dinner date. If I can imagine myself sitting having a meal with this person, or individuals within the organization, and I can see myself having a social meeting where we don't really talk about work, where we just have a nice interaction, that would be most likely a really good candidate versus someone who either we rub each other the wrong way, or it's just there's too much friction, there isn't enough commonality. So it sounds like you have signed a kind of a similar attitude of just making sure things work. And then it's great that you offer this 90-day guarantee in case things just end up not working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, nobody has ever actually taken us up on that. So I'm sure somebody might in the future. So far, we haven't. And I think part of the reason is, after you've been to 3 or 4 calls, and some of these calls are an hour, 2 hours, you get a good sense of one another. And, we're going to spend a lot of time together in meetings. For most clients, this is a 12-month at a time endeavor. So we have to work together for the next year. It should be a good fit for both people on that table.
So shifting the focus a bit then to more technology space, I imagine there would be certain technologies that nonprofit already has when before you come on board and start helping and advising. What technologies do you normally see when working with your nonprofits?
I mean, all clients will have a good handle on their CRM most of the time. Then we're seeing more and more sort of different pieces of tech that have been cobbled together over the years that are not necessarily communicating with each other all the time. But we are seeing more and more of that becoming important to clients is a way to integrate more of their tech stack and also automate some of it.
Because this is obviously a topic close to my heart, do you have any favorite CRMs, or does it really matter which CRM you work with? Do you find some that are more popular than others? Could you speak a bit more about CRM specifically?
There is a fair bit of, I don't know if legacy software is the right way of putting it, but there seems to be a few sort of CRMs that haven't maybe kept up with the times as much, that are still fairly prevalent in the sector. The 2 CRMs that we often see clients have that can work very well for a client. One of them is Salesforce, and I know, Alex, that you are a Salesforce architect. So this wasn't planned by any means, but one of them is Salesforce. But we have seen the instances of Salesforce we've seen where the client hasn't invested in setting it up correctly have been sort of nightmares. And Salesforce is really great if you invest in building it out the right way, and it's all about the build, right? It's all the beauty of Salesforce is that it can do anything you want it to do, and then the downside of Salesforce is that it can do anything you want it to do. And so if that discipline isn't there of how you're going to architect the data, map everything, who gets to add fields, who gets to make changes, how are we going to log things? Do we have a standard way of pulling different reports and getting at data? If you have that in place, Salesforce is a great CRM to have. A lot of people, because Salesforce has the free plan for nonprofits, they start there not realizing that you really need to invest in somebody to help you build it out properly. And then the other one is Virtuous, which is becoming more and more popular, and it's a great user friendly interface, and the automations within Virtuous are easy to use. So those are the 2 big ones that we like to see, I guess. There's also Donor Perfect, which is a pretty good solution, and a few others, but yeah, Salesforce and Virtuous.
Yeah, I'm a bit biased towards Salesforce, but even myself, I would not say it's always the best fit for every client. There are elements, there needs to be certain strategies in place before you can take full advantage, to your point, of Salesforce, making sure you got the proper team to help support it and build it, because you're right, you can do many things. So it's great to see that there is variety. It's not just, I was actually expecting a longer list of CRMs. So it's kind of cool to see just 3 main ones that you've seen through your experience.
Yeah, the Salesforce one is interesting if the organization is also using it for not just for their fundraising, but also for their program staff and to manage different areas of the organization. That's when Salesforce really becomes a very attractive solution.
So aside then from the CRM, any other technologies related to, say, volunteering or to marketing appeals, grant management? What have you seen in that space?
The software that we're always really interested in is software that makes your fundraising more human, not less human. And so a great piece of software that we're kind of excited about, and again, there's no affiliation here, is called GradaVid, and it allows you to send personal videos right from your cell phone to donors. Integrates with different CRMs. So it's a that's one of those great solutions that just makes your fundraising more human and leverages technology for what it's supposed to do, which is to help you have deeper relationships with donors and more relationship with donors.
I've also noticed you have, and it's common to have a newsletter. Do you think there's a value for nonprofits to build and maintain a newsletter with the subscribers?
This is one of those it depends answers. uh, I think maybe 10 years ago, we were telling nonprofits that you should think of yourself as a media organization and build an audience. And you can do that through a newsletter. Depending on the nonprofit that you are, it makes more sense. For some advocacy organizations, it makes a whole lot of sense. In 2022, we are talking to clients about building a community and not building an audience. And so community, an audience is still sort of a one-to-many model where you basically gather a bunch of people that you get to have a conversation with, but oftentimes that's a one-to-many conversation. And building a community looks a lot more participatory. And so in that sense, a newsletter may or may not be the best bet for you. You may want to do something else, right? You may want to have a space where you get to co-build a little bit more. You may want to invest more in building online communities. You may want to invest more in actually helping your donor base, people who are your supporters, get to know each other and connect with each other.
I like the idea of shifting from a one-to-many to a community. I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you think there's any risk, though, in terms of just sharing personal information across that community? Or like, is it, I can see the benefits of asking other nonprofits, hey, how do you do X, Y, Z, versus some kind of comparison between the two. I'm looking for the right words here, but like there's always pros and cons to the community fundraising, not fundraising, sorry, but newsletters. You have a lot more control, obviously, over the messaging. But you're right; it's more of an announcement type of situation, not so much. It doesn't allow so much reciprocation and feedback versus the community. You can really collaborate and see things. But I imagine there must be a few drawbacks to that as well that you may not want to. You don't have as much control. You might have to moderate certain messages.
Yeah, absolutely. And for newsletter, it probably comes down to what is the value proposition of having a newsletter. I mean, just anecdotally, we see less and less people actually care about that sort of stuff. Our inboxes feel like they're a dumpster fire, and so we've all gotten so very protective of our email address. And what's a newsletter going to do for me that I don't already have? So a newsletter can be a great tool. I think the burden of proof on the nonprofit to actually create something people want is a lot greater than ever before. And so I wouldn't, I would be careful if you're launching a newsletter, a total value in it. I would just put a lot of thought into it, which is like, why do we deserve to put this out? And how are we going to steward the attention of the people who actually allow us into their inbox? And why should we be doing this over somebody else? Like, what's the magic sauce, or what is the benefit or the value that we can provide that the people we want to sign up for the newsletter can't find anywhere else? And that's pretty tough. That requires a bit of ingenuity.
I imagine then there would be an advantage to having a type of brand analysis to make sure that the voice that's being used in these newsletters and basically all content is not only consistent but really represents the nonprofit organization. Is this something you help build, like the branding of their voice and their persona?
Yeah, the voice that they speak in, helping organizations communicate as their authentic sort of organizational self, is something that we talk with clients about. We do newsletters for clients. They're donor newsletters. They are usually printed newsletters supported by emails. And they actually, done well, they turn from a cost center into a profit center. It is more of a newsletter that's a report back to the donor on the impact of their philanthropy. Those newsletters tend to work really well.
Yeah, showing the impact of your donations, I think, is a very strong messaging. And I definitely like the idea of the being genuine, being authentic, your authentic self, your authentic voice, because that's what resonates with people, right? They don't want some corporate slick thing. It's okay if there's a few, glitches in the system if it's not super perfect, as long as it's true to the messaging.
Yeah, that's just it, right? And you you have to realize that at the end of the day, it's going to be people connecting with people. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind that a newsletter or an email, it's not a precious piece of art. Nobody's going to print it up, frame it, hang it up in their house. Nobody's going to do that, right? It's a tool. So doing it done is better than perfect. The important thing is that you're doing it. Inaction doesn't yield any information. You can sit around for a long time debating how you should do this thing, what the right headline to use is, what the right whatever content is, or you can just start putting it out and making it better as you go along and just having an attitude of continuous improvement.
It's like building the airplane as you're flying it. As long as you start and then you can adapt and change and pivot and make incremental changes. The most important thing, to your point, and I agree, is done is better than perfect. So let's get it done and then make it better.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have to realize that donors are extraordinary people by definition. Most people don't donate to charity. They're in the minority. So you're talking to extraordinary people who like to give, who are kind and compassionate. It's okay if if it's not perfect. This fear of offending people and this fear of it's got to be perfect, because what will the donor think? The donor is an extraordinary person who likes to give. Just try them. Like steward their attention well, put a lot of thought into it and put a lot of care into it and put a lot of love into it. That's the important part.
In your opinion, how has fundraising changed in the last couple of years during the pandemic?
Well, for one, it is no longer acceptable or enough to just send out donor communications and hope that donors will give. I think the organizations that we've seen that not only survived sort of the last 2 years of pandemics and lockdowns and disruption, and now the world's a mess with the supply chain and with the war in Ukraine, and it looks like we may or may not be heading to a recession. Organizations who are thriving are organizations who have built actual like human connections and relationships with donors and called them to do something specific and meaningful, something that matters, and who are actually treating donors like they're an important part of the team. So going back to building an audience versus building a community, before maybe you saw donors as an audience, and that's fine. Hopefully in the last 2 years, you've started seeing donors as a community. And there's a few things that define a community. And one of those things is communion. And I don't mean communion in a religious sense, communion as in communing with one another. And so nonprofits who haven't figured that piece out is how to actually have like human, real, honest, like relationships that are, beyond just you behind the keyboard. Those are nonprofits that are building resiliency, and who, if I had to put my, if I had to put my money, like if I had to make bets, I would always bet on nonprofits that know their donors better, even if they have fewer donors than nonprofits who have a ton of donors but don't know that much about them.
So that's the past. What about the future? What could you, not that you have a crystal ball or anything, but if you had to predict based on what you've seen, where do you think fundraising is going in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I'm a lousy futurist, but I will tell you the kind of stuff we're talking about with clients. One of them is helping donors understand that their philanthropy can be more meaningful than just cash gifts. So a lot of organizations have a fairly robust major donor program. And then they've got this mass and middle level donor program without realizing that what we sometimes call quote unquote mass donors or mid-level donors probably have a higher capacity to give. They just haven't been challenged to step up to the plate. And so talking to clients about talking to donors about making gifts that come from their wealth rather than just their cash. So making gifts from donor advised funds, making gifts of stocks, of shares, depending on where you live in the world, gifts from a life insurance policy. A lot of donors who, and by the way, in Canada and the USA, a young donor is like 50, 55 plus. So they're at a stage in life where they likely have decent retirement funds, decent savings, stocks, shares, the different investments, and it most of the time you can use those vehicles to make a gift, and it's might be a larger gift, and it oftentimes is more tax advantageous for the donor to make that gift as well, because you might have a double tax benefit depending on how you give. So that's one of the things, is just especially now, I don't know if we're heading for a recession, but let's say we are, just as a mental exercise. And we know inflation is, according to the government, it might be 5 or 6 or 7%, but anybody who's paying 9 to 20% more for certain stuff at the cash register knows that it's hurting their wallets. And so people might be a little bit more judicious when it comes to their cash giving. But so now is a good time to talk to them about making gifts that are not cash. And donors who have real estate investments, it's been a good few years for them. So even if they have less cash in their wallet right now, their portfolio would have done really well. So that's one of the big sort of strategic moves that we're encouraging clients to make.
I'm curious to know now, have you seen or have you spent any time in the crypto space? You talk about stuff that's not cash. Crypto obviously is in the middle between cash and not cash, I guess. That fluctuates all over the place. You did mention that the most of the donors you've seen are above 50, so maybe they're not so in tune with what is crypto and how it works. But overall, what's your impression about crypto as a donation?
I'm interested in it personally, and I don't mean to be harsh, but I'm not interested in it at all for our clients. And I'll tell you a little bit why. I'll tell you a little bit why. So first of all, I'm interested in personally just because I think it's fascinating that the overall message of crypto is about decentralization. And so if you follow Marshall McLuhan's sort of the medium as the message way of thinking, then what is crypto really about? Well, maybe it's really about the fact that trust in institutions is down, and that in the future, we don't want to rely on centralized systems and institutions and different layers of authoritative sort of bureaucracy or control to do some of the things we want to do. So maybe philanthropy in the future will be more interested about, why do I have to go through an organization to help somebody escape war? Why can't I wire that person some crypto directly, because crypto is traceable and all of that? I will know the impact of my gift because I'll be able to see exactly how it's used. Right. So personally, I'm interested in that. For our clients so far, I'm not interested in it at all, because they're not even doing, a lot of organizations aren't doing some of the other basics well yet. They're still trying to improve that. And so crypto seems like a big, shiny distraction. That might be the shiny new thing, but there's all these other things that we're still not doing well as a sector. Like, we still don't actually take the supporter experience all that serious. We're still not measuring the donor experience. We're still not doing some of these other basic things that are kind of expected everywhere else in the world, except in the nonprofit sector, are just taken for granted. So that's why we're not talking to clients about crypto. It also seems like crypto donors might be a different kind of donor. They might have different expectations. They seem to be, there is a huge world of crypto philanthropy. It's fascinating. I'm following it very closely. But the crypto philanthropists seem to be a completely different kind of breed of philanthropists, which is refreshing to see, but also for a lot of organizations, maybe not a good fit at this point.
Can you share some of these differences between the crypto donors and the more traditional donors?
Yeah, just in terms of how an organization might report back on a gift, right? A crypto donor would be very interested in having probably a large degree of involvement, potentially ownership of the project, a lot of real-time sort of updates, and a lot of large organizations just aren't set up to provide that kind of an experience.
So staying on the same topic of the future, what's the near future plan for BuildGood?
We're a service business, and we are continuously improving our core service offer. But I realize that, we get calls from people that we are just out of their price range, because like I said before, you're looking at sort of the price of an employee on a yearly basis, and all the stuff that we're learning. I'd love to find a way to pass that on, and so we're thinking that in the future we may try to give access to our sort of internal learnings and internal trainings, and even our team to people in different way, whether that is some sort of online community, or whether that's some sort of maybe interactive workshop, or like a series of workshops, or course, or sort of intensive strategy sprints. But that's where we're trying to go, in sort of the medium term.
So I noticed you have two podcasts, one for Build Good and one for donor growth. And I'm just curious to know at a high level, what trends have you noticed in the past little while, or what experiences have you noticed by the ability of you having these podcasts?
Well, first of all, the willingness of people to come on a podcast is amazing, right? Like I've got two podcasts. One is the Build Good fundraising podcast, where we interview experts in the field, and people have been so willing and generous to come on the show and share sort of their secret sauce. And if you ask somebody to come on your blog or write a guest blog, a lot of people would say, well, I don't think I have the time for that. Thank you for asking, but no. But podcast is this really interesting medium where people are very willing to come on a podcast and to just sit down for half an hour or an hour and just share. And so that's been it's been really neat to see, and it's allowed our listeners to just get the benefit of all of these different experts who are donating their time essentially and doing some free consulting every 2 weeks on our podcast. The other podcast, Donor Growth Podcast with Luis Diaz, is not a guest show at all. It's just it's our way of sharing our point of view and just stretching our muscles a little bit in sharpening our point of view and just sharing with people where we think fundraising is going. And this goes back to building an audience. We talked about building an audience versus building a community before. When do you get the chance to talk to a few hundred people at a time, and when do you get the chance to do it every single week? Just a few years ago, that would have been unheard of. And so podcasting is this really interesting medium to me because people get to know you. It feels very intimate when somebody's listening to your voice. They're listening to it in their headphones while they're going on a run or in a car, so you're riding along with them in the car as their passenger. They get to know you. They get to be familiar with you. And some of my favorite podcasts that I listen to, I kind of feel like I know the host, even though I can't really see them, right? But just from like listening to them and having listened to hundreds of hours, so that's why podcasting is such an interesting medium to me, is A, because people are so generous to come on podcasts and share information, and B, because you get to develop in a sort of intimate relationship with listeners, even though it's still a one-to-many medium.
I've heard it called a asymmetric intimacy, where your audience gets to know you a little bit, your personality, through your voice, through your general demeanor and character. But of course, you don't know them, so it's asymmetrical.
Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good way of describing it. I've never heard it put that way, but that's exactly the feeling that I have when I listen to podcasts, which is, man, I really know this person. But then if I ever met them, they'd be like, "Who are you?" I'd be like, "Well, I know everything about you," not in a creepy way, but I just know how you think.
Exactly. I was listening to the Sam Harris podcast recently, and one thing that he noticed was that when listening to podcasts and doing another activity, that other activity becomes less tedious. And he used the example of, if you're driving in the car and you're listening to a podcast, the drive itself doesn't seem, unless you have an emergency to go to, whether you show up a few minutes later to your destination or not doesn't make such a difference, because you're already entertaining another element of your brain, right? You're listening to a podcast, you're gaining knowledge, and so that kind of passive attentiveness can actually work in your favor.
Yeah, and it's also, if you're doing a tedious task and you're listening to a podcast and it's a podcast you enjoy, not only are you learning, but it feels like you're kind of doing that task with a friend, right? Because you've got somebody else in your ear. So,
right. I'm always curious about this because, as you know, this is still a relatively new podcast, and I'm learning as I go myself. So it's great to see and to hear a bit more about the more experienced podcasters.
Yeah, I know that podcast as a whole, I know there's a lot of podcasts, and I know that it's kind of a long tail medium and that just very few podcasts ever make it big. But to me, they're not going away. There's going to be more and more of them. And even if you have a small audience, even if you have a tiny audience, I think it's totally worth the effort as long as you have the right audience. You don't need hundreds of listeners. You don't need thousands of listeners. You just need the right listeners. And what a privilege to get to hang out with the right people once a week or every 2 weeks or once a month or whatever it is.
I could talk a lot about this, but again, I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find more about you online?
Probably the best way to find me is on LinkedIn. If they look for Mike Duerksen, Duerksen, I try to share everything we're learning on LinkedIn. That's the only platform I really hang out in. And I love connecting with people on there. I love connecting with fellow fundraisers and fellow nonprofit leaders. Or you can go to buildgood.com. That's sort of our hub for everything BuildGood. And we also have the BuildGood fundraising podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, you might be into podcasts. So you can also look for the BuildGood fundraising podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
And we'll put those links into the show notes below. Listen, Mike, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Alex. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again next time for Agents of Nonprofit.